Kim Sepich to move us right into the conversation.
Thanks, AJ, and good morning, everyone. I'm Kim Sepich, the Director of Executive Leadership Programs here at the Belk Center. We thank you for joining us today. Before we begin, I would like to share just a few logistical notes. To be respectful of everyone's bandwidth, we ask that you mute your microphone during the session. We also ask that you leave your video on this time. If you've been with us in previous sessions, I think sometimes we also ask you to mute your video. But this time we want to be sure that we can maximize our connections with one another throughout the session, particularly in the discussion segments. So if you're able to leave your video on, that would be great. You are welcome to introduce yourself in the chat feature that's located in the control bar at the bottom of your screen. And you're also welcome to use the chat feature to ask questions or share thoughts during the session. We will look to the chat feature as we move through the program and try to answer a few questions if we're able to. If we're unable to answer your question during the session, then we'll post the answers to the Belk Center President's webpage afterwards. We are recording this session, but there are a couple of segments that will not be recorded. We will not record the data discussion that will happen in just a few minutes, and we will not record the small group conversations. Everything else will be recorded. And the recording and the slides will be shared on the Belk Center President's webpage as well. So now let's get started, and please join me in welcoming Dr. Mary Ritling.
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with all of you again, and I hope you're all doing well. So we're going to continue the conversations that we've had both in the symposia that we had in March and also throughout the summer and the beginning of this fall on critical conversations related to the changes that have happened since COVID. And this is a continuation of the conversation on equity. And particularly, we have heard from the presidents about delving even deeper and hearing, as AJ mentioned and Kim, that we hear the perspective of not only our North Carolina presidents, but also some presidents from around the country and the work that they're doing. So to get us started, you probably have all seen this particular little slide. And my guess is that you've probably used it in your conversations on your campuses. And we typically have looked at equity in this way, is that somehow we have to get folks from one point to the other, and where are the inequities that maybe a student is experiencing. And this slide particularly has worked very, very well for us and has gotten the message across. But something has happened, right? Something has happened. And since March, as we all know, we have been affected by a number of, and maybe made more aware of, a significant number of external factors that are really influencing change, not only in our campuses, but change in our communities, change in our state, and change in our country. And this is just a little laundry list of those external factors that seem to be raising our consciousness and making it more critical in many ways for us to look at equity. We would be remiss in not recognizing the global pandemic, which has really kind of brought us here today to have this conversation, the racial injustice that we're experiencing, the sweeping global support for racial equity, unemployment rates that exceed the Great Recession, changing geopolitical dynamics, major demographic transitions, growing income inequality, college debt burden, disruptive fourth industrial revolution, and of course, the climate change. And a lot of these really respectfully, have more significance maybe in some areas than others, but the reality is these external factors are affecting our equity agenda. With that being said, we know that the impact of COVID-19 particularly, and we've studied this, we know this in North Carolina, about the folks that have been most disenfranchised in our communities. And COVID-19, of course, has really highlighted some of these issues. Individuals with low wage, low income, low skill, no savings, and no health care have really kind of come to the surface. Our understanding and awareness that the Black and Brown populations are most affected by the virus, and also the economic disparities associated with it. We've all experienced, either on our campuses, in our communities, with our families, the technological divide that COVID-19 has really made most aware of, and of course, economic marginalization. The impact of COVID-19 is forcing us to address the intersections of both the external and internal factors versus addressing them individually. So with that, it's made us think differently, and there are a number of things that have come forward as a result of it. And I particularly love this particular slide, and it has to do with that. Well, we've had conversations about equity. We now also have to include our conversations about social justice. And where does equity and social justice fit in our education agenda and the conversation that we're having? It speaks to us to say, as leaders, we must be brave, and we have to put our ears to our hearts. We have to listen. We have to be engaged. We have to be self-reflective. We have to be unflinching into the mirror that provides evidence about what these recent events are doing, not only to individuals, but also to our regions and our state and our nation. And then we have to ask them really hard questions. What am I going to do about it, and what do I see? With that, it sort of changes this picture for me. I particularly love this. And this has to do with the fact that there are realities that we must take into account. We have to look at equality and equity, but our ultimate goal is the liberation of our students and of our citizens so they have opportunity. The Belk Center staff has taken this very seriously, and like you, we have been thinking about what is our equity-minded mindset and what is our equity-minded framework. We have spent a significant amount of time looking at different frameworks and, of course, studying just like you, and we have really committed to and found to be a good foundational piece the work of Dr. Benseman. And what we have identified for us are certain key points that she highlights in her work. And they are that we must be intentionally focused on the educational results for our Black, Hispanic, and Native American students. We must establish a mindset shift that involves constant questioning, knowing that we're always evolving in this understanding of what is equity and the role that we play, and whether or not our systems and our structures are perpetuating or eliminating barriers for Black and Brown students. And we must have a sense of equity-mindedness that describes our actions, not just our words, but our actions that demonstrate individuals' capacity to recognize and address racialized structures, policies, and practices that produce and sustain racial inequalities. We have taken out a framework at the Belk Center that looks like this, and you can see they're cogs in a wheel, and they all kind of flow together. You can't look at one without recognizing what the impact is going to be on each of the cogs. So first cog is evidence-based, looking at data and examining it and taking really a critical introspection into the data. What is it telling us? What are we doing? What are we not doing? Also understanding our racial conscious, our institutional focus, how we look at things from an institutional perspective. What are our systemic awarenesses? And then putting these all together, how are we looking at advancing our equity agenda? Our commitment is clear, that we as a center are focused on economic mobility, community building, and improving the success, of course, of our students, particularly our Brown and Black and students, and also our American Indian students. We are strongly committed, as you can see in the two bullets that are highlighted here, to racial equity through dismantling the systemic barriers that impede historically underserved populations, and achieving this through our academics, achieving this through the work that we're doing in the Belk Center, through our executive leadership program, through our doctoral program, and through the work that we do in research. Others are also going through a change. And as we look at our structures and our frameworks, many of you have used the Aspen Institute framework as you develop your student success plans across your campuses. They are focused, of course, on the pillars of learning, completion, transfer, and workforce. But one of the things that has happened within the Institute is the understanding and a commitment that equity is embedded throughout each one of these pillars. And how we look at learning, how we look at completion, how we look at transfer, and how we look at workforce must be addressed from a standpoint of students of color and low-income students, and how equitable are our access to these students and our outcomes. This summer, I had an opportunity to be engaged with, I should say, with Dr. Rachel Rawl, and she is an assistant professor at the University of California, and she works extensively on this issue of equity, and particularly equity in governance. And I was able to ask her a number of questions on a panel, and she shared with us this slide, which I think is extremely helpful. If you take the word equity and you just look at the letters, these are the things that we should be thinking about as leaders. How do we examine and disaggregate the data? How do we question the areas of inequities? How do we understand how to facilitate the conversation? And I must admit, even when I was a president, facilitating this conversation on equity is very difficult at times. It causes us to have to really, not only look at ourselves, but also look at our audiences and how we can engage the equity conversation in the culture of our institutions. Insist on clear outcomes and timelines, that what we do must be not just in words, as I said before, but in actions. How we're going to tackle the barriers so that we can deal with the inequities that we see in our institutions so that our students can be successful. And then finally, we are looking to yield resources, finding the resource to really meet our equity agenda, and then executing our strategies.
Good. I guess it's still morning. It's 11:40 a.m. as I look at the time on the screen. And I will say I'm delighted to be with all of you and certainly join the Belk Center as they work with the North Carolina community colleges in your work and your commitment to student success. I have taken the opportunity to scroll through the gallery view. So I want to say hello to some old friends. I think about Carol Spalding. We too served on the board of directors of AACC. Michael Elam and I met when we were fellows in the Lakin Institute, sponsored by the President's Roundtable of African American CEOs in the nation's community colleges. And there are so many others that it's just a pleasure to be with you today. As I was listening, I thought back to my own time in college, which was probably longer than I would really like to recall. But in 1972, I entered my freshman year in college. And let me just share with you the experience I had the very first week. The first thing is that we were the largest number of students of color to ever enroll at that institution. There were probably about 200 or so. It was overwhelmingly white and fairly rural if you think about Pennsylvania. I was born and raised in Pennsylvania, on Western Pennsylvania, close to Pittsburgh. And the first week of class, the English professor, there were 3 African Americans in the class, and he asked us to stay for a few moments after class had completed for that day. And here's what he said to us. I don't really believe any of you belong here. This is an affirmative action ploy, and the institution had to accept you. So I'm going to make it easy for you. I'm going to give one of you an A, one of you a C, one of you an F. You don't even have to come back to class. All you have to do is tell me who's going to get what grade. Now, this was 18 years of age, being in an environment that I had never been in before, because while I went to an integrated elementary, middle, and high school, we were segregated by where we lived. And I didn't even have enough knowledge to know that I could go to someone and really challenge what he said to us. But we met as 3 18-year-olds, and we decided that whatever he thought about us when he saw our color and not our intellect was not going to damage what we had gone to that institution to do. So it was tough, I will tell you, but we all got out of that class with either a B or a C. I know that I didn't make an A and I didn't make the C, but we just made a commitment to support each other and to just wade through what clearly was a racist environment. And I only tell you this story because now, and I started that institution in 1972. Next week, there are at least 20 African-American students who have been asked to go back to that institution to be part of a task force on diversity, equity, inclusion, and the eradication of racism. So even as I listened to Dr. Ritling go through the slides and talk about the kinds of things that we are all facing today, a global pandemic, racial unrest, what I would tell you is that these things are not new. Brown and Black people have been undervalued, marginalized, and minimized in this country for more years than any of us have been on this earth. And so we're at an inflection point in the United States of America. And I think that what has happened is that the pandemic has exposed the inequities in education, in healthcare, in income, and all of those things with which we find ourselves grappling today. So I'm here to talk to you about a story in Prince George's County. And before I get there, we have a trailer for a documentary that we did with regard to our African-American male students. So I would ask Kim if you could show the trailer, Striving for the Extraordinary.
Going to school for 4 years, that's kind of a road less traveled. It's kind of odd in a way.
It's not something that is commonly presented to a young Black male.
We really don't understand why we're in college.
I can do better, but I'm not pushing myself hard enough.
And that makes me wonder, why am I here?
But the plain fact is, there are some Americans who in the aggregate are consistently doing worse in our society.
I can't be successful if I can't write or spell right.
How long were you in? 7 years. Adam came out with what I told you some of you guys are missing, urgency. I don't have time to waste.
I see young men across the college every day, and I know that some are very focused and understand who they are and what they want. And I know others that we have to wrap our arms around them.
For a lot of the African Americans, males who struggle, they don't always have, the right people around them.
Some of you have never seen this before. You never had someone in your life who wants to see you win more than you do.
We weren't used to men on this campus holding us accountable.
You show up to your classes, but you're not giving 100% of yourself. I am gonna get you when I see you. But after I'm done, I'm gonna embrace you like a brother, and we're gonna keep rocking.
It has totally changed my life, seriously.
Glad I came to community college first, because I was honest with myself after high school, I wasn't ready for a 4-year.
These young men have persevered longer in college. Their grade point averages are rising.
A retention rate that's almost 40% higher than the average student.
My whole inner being, soul, body told me, associate degree now, back to the grind and get my bachelor's.
Stay committed to the journey. I guarantee to become a better man, a better son, a better father, whatever your goals are. So I show that to you just as a teaser, and I know in the resource section you'll have the opportunity, should you choose, to look at the full documentary, for which Prince George's Community College won a Telly Award. But the award is not what's important. The award, quite frankly, was in the success of the young men whose lives we've had the opportunity to touch since 2009 in a very different way. And let me start with the demographics of Prince George's County. I moved there in 1995 with my family to accept the role of Vice President for Student Services. Today, as a matter of fact, when I moved there, the election had just occurred for the first African-American county executive who may be analogous to a mayor in the communities where you all live and serve. That was a big deal. Prince George's County is probably now just about 450 years old, one of the original settlements as individuals came here from other lands. Today, there are about 1 million residents in Prince George's County, 63% of whom identify as African or Black, African American or Black, 16% Hispanic, Latinx, 14% white, and 7% who are other, a mix of races or the like, or you know, because noting who you are racially or ethnically is optional now. The median household income is about $80,000 a year. And there are many regions across Prince George's County where the median income is more than $250,000 a year. We are touted as the most affluent African-American community in the nation based upon income. And yet I will tell you that there are severe pockets of poverty, and COVID has hit Prince George's County worse and harder than any other jurisdiction in the state of Maryland. So how do you talk about income and affluence? And then we have the highest rates of diagnoses of COVID and the highest numbers of death. So there is something missing in that equation. And then we get to Prince George's Community College. 91% of our students identify as students of color. 73% Black or African American, 13% Hispanic or Latinx, 7% white, 5% Asian, and about 2% Native American or other. So some would say that given the demographics of our community, that we are oversubscribed in terms of the racial mix of our students. Women account for about 68% of our population, men 32%. 71% receive some form of financial aid, predominantly Pell Grants. 56% are from first-generation families. Neither parent or guardian ever stepped on a college campus or engaged in any kind of post-secondary opportunity. And 80% of the students work 2 or more jobs, totaling anywhere from 30 to 80 hours a week. When you think about that, how can you focus in college when where your heart is and where your mission is to take care of your families at whatever cost it takes? So in 2008, a year after I had been named president, like most of you, I met regularly with students, the Student Governance Association, clubs and organizations. I went to classes. We had, and it still exists today, what we called Pizza with the President, because you always know if you give food, students will come. And I noted 2 things during those meetings, that there were few men in student leadership roles, and there were actually few men who ever attended the meetings. And those who were in the meetings were constantly challenging me about the commitment that they felt that the college did not have to them, either individually as faculty, staff, administrators, or collectively as an institution. So I went back and after I had heard it for some number of meetings, I went to our institutional research office and I asked them for information. Tell me what numbers and percentages of men of color are here at the college. Give me their retention rates, their persistence rates, their first year, what successes they were having in their first year classes, how many were in developmental courses, what were their graduation rates, transfer rates. You all know the drill. I asked for all of that information. And what I found was that About 70% of them were in developmental or remedial courses. Less than 5% exited those courses in any successful way. By any measure that we define success, less than 5% met it. And only 2 to 3% were moving on to those gateway courses in English and math. You know, English 1 and your first level math course, which is generally college algebra. So I sat and talked with, you know, what we found is that the results of students of color, particularly men of color, were lackluster at best, and they were dismal and disheartening at their very worst. No wonder there was a revolving door at Prince George's Community College. And when I arrived in 1995, the institution was predominantly white. It is as the community changed in Prince George's County, then so did the student body at our institution. Now the student body changed, the people who work there, we all know that that change occurs slowly as people choose to retire, to look for other employment opportunities, resign for one reason or another, and where it was necessary to do so, we asked people to leave. So I engaged in a dialogue then with the senior administration, with faculty, with other administrators, with staff, with members of our larger community, the external community, and with the Board of Trustees. And I'll tell you one faculty comment that so many years later stands out to me even today. He said, you know, Charlene, when we had more white students, we were a better institution. When we had more white students, we were a better institution. And I thanked him for saying that to me, because what that did is it spurred me to action. I asked for a plan. I pulled a couple of people together who represented a number of constituencies across the college, and I asked for a plan as to how we could support students of color, and particularly men of color. I never received that plan. There was all the passive aggressiveness that we could imagine that was occurring, because people did not believe that we should spend much needed resources on a particular population. The young men were described as lazy. They weren't college material. They were only here to get the financial aid benefits. I could go on and on and on. So what I did as the president, I decided that I was going to act. I developed a position description, and I asked for someone to come to Prince George's Community College who could both create, manage, run, and give us a successful program that focused on what we call diverse male students. And so that gentleman came, and he is still at Prince George's Community College today. But I asked him to do several things. I wanted him to understand and communicate the data about young men of color. I wanted him to create opportunities for collective action to identify and address the reasons for the lack of success for these men of color. I wanted him to engage the men of color to listen and to learn, to understand what their issues were, where they were coming from, and what they saw as their next journey or next step in life. I wanted him to develop internal and external partners to bring resources to bear on the issues. Those resources could have been money, but those resources also could be people with whom they would never have the opportunity to engage just because of circumstances from which they came. I also wanted to allow the college to invest in targeted interventions for a program focused on developing men for success and leadership. So I'll tell you what the discussions revealed, that for young men, as you heard in the trailer, that they had a deep uncertainty about their ability to be successful, because all of their lives they had been told that they couldn't be. And those who they looked up to as role models in their communities weren't really successful either, because they didn't live on the right side of the tracks of the most affluent African-American community in the United States. They had a need for guidance and coaching and mentoring. They lacked self-confidence. They didn't know how to manage their time. There were academic barriers. They couldn't navigate all of the academic language and processes and procedures that we put in place. And they couldn't access the available academic supports or student services supports. For the most part, they didn't even know anything about them. And there was a tremendous lack of family support, because most families, for most of these families, these young men were the breadwinners. They were the ones who were going out and working anywhere from 30 to 80 hours a week and taking their paychecks home so their mom or their parents could make ends meet for themselves and their siblings. So our first cohort in 2009, 5 students who said, there must be something about this. So we're going to sign up to be a part of this thing called the Diverse Male Student Institute. They were leery of the college's commitment to them, given the experiences that they had had. They did not trust the process, nor did they trust the people. So much so that as I was walking around the college talking about it and introducing myself as the president, do you know that there were a few students who, my executive associate came in my office one day and she said, there are a group of students out here to see you. And I said, is there something wrong? You know, that's your first thought, is there something wrong? And she said, well, here's what they said to me. There was a woman who was walking around in the dining hall, sitting at tables of students, asking them how they were doing and that you all were creating this program. And she wanted to know if we were interested. We came over here to see, is there a Black woman who's president of Prince George's Community College? So for these students, they couldn't even imagine that I was who I said I was. So I went out, we laughed, I invited them into the office, and I think 2 of them were part of the first cohort. So what we understood that we needed to do, and I would tell you that their willingness resulted in 3 of the 5 were African-American males and 2 were Hispanic. So Brian had the opportunity to create a program, and he called it DMSI, a gathering of men, because what we wanted them to see is that they were not boys, they were not whatever title that somebody else wanted to give them, that they were men, and that we wanted to treat them that way. We wanted to work with them on self-improvement, on believing in self and others, on serving their communities, receiving mentoring, advising, introducing them to support services, taking them through career and personal development training, having the opportunity for internships, externships, working with external entities that were really assigned to us by our foundation, the Prince George's Community College Foundation. So we were able to get them jobs and also have those external partners understand that they needed to make money, that it wasn't so they could just have the experience. Many of them didn't have the resources to go out to purchase a white shirt and a pair of pants and a belt. So they couldn't even go to work in a way that made them look professional, the way that they wanted to be perceived. And I reminded them all the time, I said, so here's what we're going to do. You all are going to go, at the time, I don't know that Kmart is still around. I know it's not in our community anymore. But I said, we're going to go to Kmart and Walmart, and we're going to get you 3 white shirts and 2 pair of slacks. And you can change, you can wash those shirts every other night so that you make sure you have a clean, crisp white shirt and that you show up to work on time and you show up to work as though you were serious about the environment in which you find yourself. So I think that some of the things that we've uncovered during COVID has been that this thing called poverty is bigger and much more far-reaching than any of us could have imagined. We also wanted them to understand what we call the social determinants of success: self-esteem, believing that they mattered, that they can be productive in their communities. They can make a contribution. They can make a difference because they were going to be different, present differently than what had been the case for them for the first 18, 24, 30, or 35 years of their lives. And they could count on us for support. They could trust us, and that we were going to trust them. So these young men today have to develop a 5-year plan. So it takes them from their first semester beyond what we consider the average of 3 years or so for an associate degree. So that's the first part, their 5-year plan. Where do you want to be in 5 years? And when they get towards the end of their associate degree work, they develop the next series of plans about where they see themselves 5 years after that. So they set goals for themselves, and as part of that goal setting, we work with them to measure progress. Now, when I say we, as the president, I stepped in every now and then. We partnered with organizations from across our county, 100 Black men, Alpha Phi Alpha, Kappa Alpha Psi, Omega Psi Phi, what you all know for those of you who are aware, the 5 male fraternities that make up what we call the Divine Nine, those Black fraternities and sororities. We partnered with African American, Hispanic, and Asian employees, men who were in significant positions across the college, who these students had never encountered because they were in enterprise technology, they were in the business area, administration and finance, but they were vice presidents, they were deans, directors, executive directors, but they were employed in positions where the students would never have had an opportunity to come across them. We created internships for students on our campuses so that if they couldn't get a job off campus, we put them in enterprise technology. We created a student employment program if they weren't eligible for work study through Pell Grants. And we just did everything that we could in order to lift them up and help them understand that their lives could be better than what they had experienced prior to that. The other thing that I will tell you is here's what success looked like. From 2009 to 2015, their retention rates rose from 30% to 48%. From 2015 to 2019, retention rates rose from 38 to 48 to 87%. So over that time, it went up about 57 percentage points because of the focused work. Today, the Diverse Male Student Initiative has served more than 1,500 young men. They are college graduates, they have master's degrees, they are in doctoral programs, they have gone to Morehouse, Columbia, Harvard, Yale, the University of Maryland College Park, Emory, Georgia Tech, Georgetown, North Carolina A&T, Bowie State University, Howard University, Morgan, the University of Maryland Eastern Shore. And they all have had a commitment to come back to support the program that was the foundation for them and to serve as mentors to the current students that we have. For spring of 2020, DACA was the valedictorian at Morehouse College. We had 3 students at Morehouse who were the beneficiaries of the billionaire Robert Smith, who told them in his commencement address that he would pay off their loans so that they would not leave college in debt. So this has been a long journey for us. You know, in some cases, I guess if you do the math, it's about 11 years. It was not without its challenges, but what we knew is that in a community where we brag about affluence on the one hand, and we see abject poverty on the other, and we understand what was happening to men of color from 2009, at least at our institution, that we needed to make some changes. And that as the president, I just made a decision. It was what some would tell you if they were on this call with me, that it was unilateral at most, and it was about a passion for me to see our young men do better and to understand that they were at an institution where we believed that we had a collective responsibility to be accountable for their success. So what I will tell you is that in this day of COVID, we found out a couple of things. That our young men at Prince George's Community College continue to be first in their family to even think about post-secondary education. They come to us having served sentences for felonies or misdemeanors. They are the sole providers for their families, their parents, their siblings. They are fathers themselves. And as I've already told you, they continue to work 20 to 80 hours a week. But the one thing we know is that they are striving for the extraordinary. And in the world we live in, for these young men to be successful, given the circumstances from which they come, they are more than extraordinary to me. They are our future, and that we have a responsibility to ensure that they can take part in what we call this American way of life. So as when I thought about this, you know, as I prepared for the presentation, I'll be frank with you, I wasn't thinking about equity in the ways that it's defined today, whether it's race or income or people who are systematically underrepresented in higher education. I was thinking about my 5 brothers, and that if I had an opportunity to do for young men like my parents and the community in which I was raised did for my 5 brothers and me, then that was a responsibility that I had, that I did not do all the work that I committed myself to do to arrive at this place called the presidency and not have the courage and the commitment to do what was right for students. So for me, I always think about the urgency of now. If not now, when? And if not us, who? So as they even continue this work in this age of COVID, I will tell you that the first session has already occurred. It is the Diverse Male Student Initiative, a virtual gathering of men. And on that virtual screen, they had more than 100 young men who wanted to begin that journey this first semester for them at Prince George's Community College. Many of you may be aware that a couple of, I guess maybe now it seems like it was so long ago, but maybe a month or 2 or 3 ago, I had the opportunity to interview Dr. Ibram X. Kendi and talk about his book and his writing, Stamped from the Beginning, How to Be an Anti-Racist. And the one thing I know is that racism has always been a part of who we are, a part of how we live, but we all have responsibilities to see to all of our students and meet their needs, their goals, their dreams, their aspirations. So equity is not just, in my mind, about color or ethnicity, it's also about income, socioeconomic status, because you know, there is something about, and I don't like to use cliches too much, but you know, the rising of all boats. And what does that mean across all of our institutions, not just in North Carolina, not just in Maryland, but across the country. So I've done lots of reading and work around the work of Sean Harper, Luke Wood, I think AAC&U. They do a lot of work around equity-mindedness and how that's not just a word, excuse me, but it's how do we act, how do we behave, what do we expect of those who work with us? And I will tell you, at Prince George's, our values were diversity, respect, success, professionalism, excellence, and lifelong learning. Now, what I would say every time I had the opportunity to speak before either faculty, staff, our entire employee population, or students, that I wasn't very much interested in your political leanings. I wasn't really interested in where you live. What I was interested in was whether or not you came to our institution to live and work toward the values that we all set as a community. That's what was important to me. And if we believed in that, then we had to believe that every student at our institution mattered and that we were going to do the work that led them to the goals that they had set for themselves. So with that, what I will tell you is I'll stop there. I don't know, I wasn't watching the clock, I'll be honest, and which is a failing that I have. But I'll stop, take a few questions if you'd like to ask any, or we can move forward with the agenda, because I know when we go into breakout groups, we'll have the opportunity to talk more in depth there as well. So Mary, if I turn it back to you.
Dr. Dukes, thank you so much. You know, as always, you inspire us, and your leadership is truly recognized, and how fortunate Prince George's Community College was to have you as their leader, and most importantly, the students, that you had the passion and desire to change their lives. I think we have time for maybe one question before we go to our presidential panel. Is there someone that would like to ask a question, or do you prefer to put it in a chat? Speak up if you have a question.
Yes, I think I want to try to put a question out for my friend and colleague, Dr. Dukes. It's so good to see you and hear you. And to, of course, I want to congratulate you on the next chapter in your life after retiring as a community college president. But I see you're still well at it. Let me ask you to give some encouragement to the people who are listening to you who don't have the privilege to be a person of color, but still have the responsibility to serve the entire population that they lead. You know, the reason I asked the question that way is because if you are a person of color and you have experienced the racism, the inequities, et cetera, all of your life, that's one thing. You have a passion to try to rectify it. But if you have not lived in those and walked in those shoes, you may be oblivious to what it's like. So can you offer some insight to those who are not walking in our shoes?
Well, I don't know if it's insight so much, but I think it really is, how do we educate ourselves? What do we see as our own unique responsibility to educate ourselves about those who we serve and those with whom we work, those with whom we live in our neighborhoods and our communities? There is so much out there now, and I know that there are some resources that have been provided to you by the Belk Center, but anything that you can do, I believe, to read about racism, anti-racism, white fragility, conscious and unconscious bias, to walk the walk. There are many institutions now that are taking these 30-day challenges. And I think you've even seen some of these quizzes. If, everyone's standing in a row. If you're right-handed, take 2 steps forward. If you're left-handed, take 2 steps backwards. If you grew up this way, and so what happens is, by the time you go through that exercise, you start looking around the room and you think about the answers to your own questions, and you recognize that there's a level of privilege somewhere that maybe you just didn't think about or weren't exposed to. And I think as college presidents, as professionals, as people who care, we can't ever stop educating ourselves. And to be able to reach out to people when we don't understand, what does this mean? What is the student trying to say to me? And not to be dismissive of people's feelings and perspectives. What I had to learn, even as a young professional, was that everybody's voice matters. And that if I was spending too much of my time trying to frame my response rather than listening to what the person was saying, then I missed a lot. And I think that that's where we have to go. Walk around your campuses. I know you all do that. Talk to students. Bring students in and ask them what's working, what isn't working. Hold the people that we hire at our institutions accountable. And if they can't be held accountable in those ways, then we have other kind of work to do. But there is so much going on now across the country with regard to work around race and equity, that I don't believe that we cannot lose this moment. We cannot lose this moment. And that's what I would say.
Thank you both for, Michael, for sharing that question, and for Charlene for the response. And I think we have an opportunity. If you have other questions, please put them in the chat, but we'd like to hear now from a couple of our colleagues. And Janet Spriggs and Lawrence have agreed to be on a presidential panel, North Carolina presidential panel, and answer a couple questions. And so with that, let me ask them a question. So I'll start first with Janet. Janet, as president, how do you look at the social issues and all that is happening? And how does that lead you to think about what the issues mean on your campus and your students?
Thank you, Mary. So when I think about the social issues and all that is happening currently, I remember back when I was working on my doctoral thesis, and I had a quote that I used, and I looked that up because I think it's very relevant to how I answer this question. And it was, I was describing my positionality or potential research bias. And this quote is from a professor at University of California that says that few things are more difficult than to see outside the bounds of our own perspective, to be able to identify assumptions that we take as universal truths, but that instead have been crafted by our own unique identity and experiences in the world. And I share that as part of my response to this question because I think it's important, certainly as college presidents and as leaders during these times of substantial social unrest, I think it's important for us to be able to see outside the bounds of our own perspective, but at the same time, recognizing that my view of these social issues in all that is happening in our country is going to be framed, at least in part, by my personal perspective, which is that culmination of my unique identity and my life's experiences. So for me, that perception, that background and that experience is important. I grew up, I was a first generation low income community college student, but the larger story of who I am and my upbringing, which I think is a critical part of my unique identity and perspective, is that of a poor white girl who grew up in a very tight-knit Christian family on a very small southern tobacco farm in rural North Carolina in the late 1960s and 70s, which was a time of turbulence in an era in our country that sadly gave me too many opportunities to be a firsthand witness to the harshness and the cruelty of social prejudice and racism and racial bigotry and marginalization. In fact, that sounds really familiar as I say that, like maybe we're in 2020 and not much has really changed. But all of that had an indelible impact on me as that young child growing up, poor and in the South, a child who, even though my parents at that time had not graduated from high school and we were very poor, I was still, even then, privileged in so many ways simply because of the color of my skin. So I may not have experienced racism or racial bigotry, but I have most certainly experienced social prejudice and marginalization and gender bias. I understand what it feels like to be treated unfairly, to be stereotyped, to be made to feel less than, simply because of where I came from. So all of those experiences, I think, play a big role in how I think about social issues, and also in how I think about what these issues mean to our students. And I'll end by saying, community colleges have always been engines for equity, that we were born to provide access to higher education for all. So I think that as a community college president, it's my professional responsibility to lead my college's equity mission. But for me, equity and social justice are also very personal. And so I'm on both a professional mission and a personal mission to make it easier for our students than it was for me. And I just want to say, I really loved Mary's slide that illustrates the difference between reality equality, equity, and liberation. And you know, I've been on this for the past year and 9 months. I've been on this equity mission. I've said publicly a couple of times I'm ready to get rid of poverty, but now I want to amend that and say that I'm on this liberation mission. You know, it is, Charlene had said, we can't lose the moment. We can't let this place in time stop us from being brave and not just talking, but using this moment as a call to action. And I think that we're uniquely positioned to be able to do that and to respond to that other question that was on one of the slides, you know, what am I going to do about what I see?
Lawrence, would you like to respond to the question? How do you look at social issues in all that is happening? And how does that lead you to think about what the issues mean on your campus and your students?
Thank you, Mary. What I see as the social issues that are currently in our community and they could actually impact what happens on our campus. And the reason I say that is because we're part of a larger ecosystem, and our students are part of the community and they're part of our campus. So we have to be very, very conscious of the things that are going on when it comes to the racial and social and civic injustices that are going on. And what I see as our campus, we strive to make sure that every student who is on our campus is valued, and that if there is any type of injustice, if there's any type of policy or any type of microaggressions that may happen on the campus, we want to address that. We also want to make sure that the campus becomes a safe place for all students. No student should feel that they are undervalued and marginalized by coming to Pitt Community College. And I'll just say that as a person of color, African American, who have experienced injustice from a very early age, growing up in South Carolina, and sort of like Janet, I also worked on tobacco farms with my granddad, but also knowing that we were in segregated schools, that our schools were not at the point of the majority schools, but you know that we did the best that we could and tried to overcome those barriers. And I'm happy to say that there are people of goodwill who certainly are out there to help. And I think that when we look at our campus, we should be people of goodwill. And if students are facing any type of barriers, let's remove those barriers. We talk about equity, and I think we've seen it evolve from equality, which was the banner of the 60s. We want equal rights, but now we see that equal rights is not all that it needs to be. We need to make sure that everyone gets what they need, not necessarily everybody gets the same thing. And so on our campus, we're equity based. Our strategic plan has been provided based upon our reviewing data on our students, looking at how they are progressing from the first semester on, ensuring that we put in supports for our students, particularly those who come from the lower socioeconomic status. So I think that when we look at what's going on in the community, all the social unrest, we need to be a place that is safe, that we make sure that we have equity on our campus, that we give individuals a chance to move forward in life and also address those poverty issues. One of my favorite persons is Dr. Dallas Herring. And I know my staff get tired of me saying this, and I'll paraphrase it, but Dr. Herring said that we take a person from where they are and take them as far as they can go. And I think that involves equity, to make sure that we give everybody the chance to be successful whenever they arrive on our campus, and to ensure that we provide them a safe place to be. So that's my thinking about what's going on now.
Lawrence, while you have the stage, let me ask you a big question.
Sure.
What have you chosen to tackle on your campus in relationship to equity? And how did you choose that issue that you're tackling?
We have chosen the gap that we see. Well, there are two things we've chosen out, and I'll share both of them. Number one is achievement gaps for our students who, again, at the lower economic status. We spent about a year looking at data and analyzing that data, and also having conversations with our faculty, our staff, our students, our board of trustees, and even our community to say, how can we improve this? How can we work forward on it? But it's our data that really informed us. And we have put in place some goals that we hope to achieve. We'll roll those out this fall, and then we'll continue to monitor those, as well as if it's not working, then we're going to circle back around and put in other additional supports. But our whole goal is to make sure that we address and not ignore the reasons that our students, particularly those of color, who may not be achieving at the levels that we think they can achieve at. So we're being data informed, and that's one of the first things that we're doing is studying, but we've completed our studies. We have goals and objectives, and it's all based on equity. The other thing is that we've looked at students in our community who have started an education at institutions and have not completed. And at last count, there were about 40,000 within the Pitt County and surrounding area. And so we will be reaching out to them to have them come back home. It's sort of the partway home that we discussed before, but we're putting together strategies to reach out to those students, particularly those of color and in certain zip codes that may need to come back and complete some sort of certification, whether it's short-term workforce training or whether it's a degree. So we're working with that to ensure that we also address the issue of poverty within our communities to help those students complete evidently what they've started and to give them success in going into careers or into additional education.
Thank you. And Janet, how about you? What's the big issue that you're tackling on your campus?
I think I better unmute before I answer the question. Similarly to what Lawrence described, you know, we have taken a serious look. Lawrence and I joined ATD together last year. We were in the same cohort, and it was so we just completed our first action plan. So we have done some of the same things. We're tackling what the data tells us we need to be looking at. And we found that, you know, the evidence was really clear. There's a compelling story. We had a gap of 15% in completion for our African American students, and then the gap was even larger when we disaggregated and looked specifically at African American males. So we're looking at the data for those places where we can see. Charlene mentioned gateway courses and number of credits earned in the first semester, in the first year, all those kinds of things to identify where the problem areas are and then identify strategies. But I'd have to say that truthfully, the very first issue that I found when I came here in January of 2019, and the first issue that we had to honestly and boldly and bravely tackle was our culture. We had to build and are still working to solidify and build our culture of belonging, or an equity mindedness culture, trying to infuse that into our DNA and strengthen our institutional capacity. And really, we had to take that on before we were even ready to have the bigger conversations about the gaps. You know, like I said, we joined Achieving the Dream, and through that work, and we started building our strategic plan. And it was very interesting. We started building our strategic plan, and the very first thing I wanted to do was to create a shared vision. And so we all collectively, institutionally, across the institution, worked on creating our shared vision, which is wonderful. It says that Forsyth Tech is a catalyst for equitable economic mobility, empowering lives and transforming communities, to give us something that we all agree we are where we're trying to go together. And we created our very first ever equity statement for the college that's part of our Vision 2025 strategic plan. And that equity statement, again, talks about, at Forsyth Tech, equity is grounded in a culture of belonging. where we will intentionally design the college experience so that every learner has what they need to be successful. So it was really interesting that we said all that and we talked about it and we created a vision and an equity statement. And it was obvious that equity was important to us, but I think what I found was that we hadn't really truly embraced equity as an intrinsic part of who we are as an institution. We had equity sort of bolted on, and it needed to be built in to our DNA. So we set about to change that. We started at the beginning by taking time to align resources, created a cabinet level position, Vice President for Equity and Inclusion. We revamped our Diversity and Inclusion Committee that was really just a group of people that got together and talked about a lot of things and turned it into the Council for Equity, Belonging, and Inclusion. And now we have turned that into an action task force. So, you know, I think that for us, the urgency was around truly embracing this work and not just paying lip service and using the words of the moment, but publicly, you know, taking a stand for action. When we got to 2020 and, you know, the dumpster fire and train wreck that this year has certainly been, we saw a magnification of all these equity challenges that our students have. And then when we had the tragic deaths of Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, that gave us an even greater sense of urgency around this work. So, you know, we I think made great strides in the past year and 9 months. We facilitated courageous conversations, but we're taking what we hear in those conversations and turning them into action. So I think that's the first thing we had to do. And then again, like Lawrence said, in addition to that, we are looking at the data to inform now what we do to try to affect change.
Thank you, Lawrence and Janet, for your insights and sharing with us where you are at your institution and not only the challenges, but the strategies that you're taking on to going forward. So appreciate your comments. And of course, Charlene, thank you. You've given us a lot to think about and inspire us, as you always have in the past, and you'll continue to do in the work that you're doing, even in retirement. So thank you, all three of you, very, very much. We're going to head into a conversation where you can share your thoughts with each other. But before we do that, I do want to pull up one more slide here as a reminder. And I think we are. And I bring this slide back to you, the word equity. And if you are thinking about and framing your conversation, the word itself, as I said to you before, kind of gives you some strategies and touch points that you can think about as you present this message to your campus. Equity, to examine disaggregated data, and you've heard that with all of our speakers. Question areas of inequities and have those courageous conversation. Understand how you as a president can facilitate these conversations to the various groups that you're in contact with. Insist on clear outcomes and timelines. It's not the words, it's the actions. Tackle the barriers, recognizing that, you know, there's steps to this. Some might be small baby steps, some are larger, but they must be tackled. And as Janet mentioned, it may be something as big as a culture. And then yield the resources. You know, really define what your outcomes are going to be and measure them. So with that, we're going to put us in some chat rooms and have a conversation around a few questions.
Welcome back, everyone. I would like to give the facilitators a few minutes to just share out, and I'm going to put them to the ultimate test and ask them to share what their groups talked about in just 1 to 2 sentences, so that way we can make sure that we get out of here on time out of respect for everyone. So why don't I start with Ken, if you would.
Sorry, I've got too many devices with too many mouses around me. I think how I could sum up a lot of what we talked about and heard, really in just a very few words, was best described by Jen in her presentation when she said, "I'm afraid many of our efforts have been bolted on as opposed to built in." And I think what we heard, a couple of comments, because we all work in community colleges, there's an assumption that everybody's bought in. I think our presidents in our conversation suggest that that's an assumption that's got to be challenged very directly, and that presidents need to spend their political capital as well as their fiscal resources to undergird the commitments that they make on their campuses. A lot of resource issues, but I think over top of the resource issue was presidents got to find that personal political commitment to focus on the culture of their institutions.
Next, Dr. Dukes, if you want to share out for your group.
So I would agree with Ken's comments around commitment and culture, but also some of the things that we know trip us up every day. The lack of belief in the data. The data that you're sharing is wrong. Somehow we went home and made it up and put it on a spreadsheet and brought it back. And how that becomes a distraction to the work. When we don't believe the information that our institutional researchers are giving us about our own institutions and communities. And I would say the kind of distancing that the COVID has had on our communities that really gets in the way of those serious, heartfelt dialogues and discussions about the work that we can do. And lastly, how do we not only understand the socioeconomic status of our students and how we can serve them better, but the same is true for our employees, that many of our employees are, quite frankly, living in poverty or impoverished circumstances.
Really great points. Last but certainly not least, Mary's group.
Yeah, I hope I'm connected because my internet is a bit unstable. So I would say in that group everything else that everyone else shared, but I want to also add a piece about how a couple presidents talked about their communities at large and how important it is to recognize that maybe those legislators and those politicians in your community may not be on the same page you are. And how do you engage them? And how courageous can you be and open about this conversation? And how do you have them become part of the conversation? And so to not take into account the politics of all of this would be remiss on our parts, and finding out how you can conduct those conversations, but more importantly, to really think about overall that your voice as a president does really matter, and how you craft those messages is really important.
Great, thank you. And thank you to all who participated in these conversations. I'm going to share my screen again and then let Mary wrap up the session. But at the same time, I'm also going to provide our session evaluation in the chat. So I do ask if you all have 5 to 10 minutes after this session or in the next few weeks, we will also be providing it in the email that has your institutional data. It really helps us at the Belk Center understand what our next steps are to continue serving you. So I will drop that.
So everyone, thank you once again. You're fabulous people. You're doing really wonderful things. And oftentimes, unfortunately, we always say, well, we're not doing enough, but you are doing good things. And so if we can kind of shift our thinking, even our own mindsets, as being not always from a deficit mindset, but from an asset mindset, that this is an opportunity. This is a courageous opportunity. It only comes once in a while, but there's, as difficult as it sounds and how difficult as it is, this is an opportunity for all of us to make significant change. So one of the things that we have done is we prepared a number of resources for you that you might be able to explore and use on your campus or even in your own professional development and your reading. And we also listed, and I think you can move the screen to the next slide, possibly. and these are, I would encourage you, if you can get in touch with these modules and webinars resources, these particular modules are excellent and they give you some grounding. And if in fact you're looking for some professional development on campus, these may be a resource that you want to use, and also maybe start with your executive team. And also included here is the video that Charlene shared with you regarding Dr. Kendi's presentation. And then next, here are some questions. These are the questions we developed that we were going to use for the presidential panel and also for your small group discussion. You may take these questions and use them as guiding questions for your team or for your campus at large, or even just to think about them. And then some questions around your data that were presented, and then also additional data to collect at your institution. We're looking forward to the next time we get together, and the value that comes out of the President's Academy is what we hear from you, what you want to discuss, what you want to learn, what you want to embrace. So please share with us your thoughts so that we can prepare for the next time we get together. Take care, and of course, please stay well.